You grab the salt shaker without even glancing at it. It just sits there, right next to the pepper, part of the furniture of every table you have ever eaten at. You tap it over your plate before your fork has touched the food. The entire motion is over in under 2 seconds. But for nearly the whole span of human existence, salt sat among the hardest substances on the planet to actually get your hands on. Not pricey, not inconvenient, genuinely, physically difficult to find. Your ancestors spent hundreds of thousands of years hunting for it, craving it, and, in plenty of documented cases, dying from the lack of it. And that pull you feel right now towards salty food, the reflex that makes a bland meal taste unfinished, that craving is ancient. It is not a preference you happen to pick up. It is a biological command wired into your nervous system long before any human being ever stood fully upright. Which raises an obvious question. When did we finally figure out how to answer it? Most people assume the answer is simple, that salt just showed up on tables the moment civilization got organized enough to bother with seasoning. That assumption falls apart the moment you actually look at how long humans lived, ate, hunted, and raised children before anyone figured out how to reliably produce or store the mineral their own bodies were quietly screaming for. The real timeline stretches back far further than most people ever stop to consider. Long before cities, long before writing, long before anything resembling a government existed to tax it or fight over it. And the story behind that timeline involves elephants, ancient clay, cracked cooking pots, entire trade empires, and eventually, gold changing hands ounce for ounce with a mineral most of us now sprinkle on food without a second thought, all of it building toward the exact shaker sitting on your own table right now. If a question like that is enough to keep you clicking through this channel week after week, subscribing just means the next one lands in your feed without any extra effort on your part. For roughly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens lived without any way to collect, store, or carry salt as an actual substance. No mines, no evaporation ponds, no container built specifically to keep it dry. What they had instead was a body screaming for sodium and a landscape that hid the mineral in scattered, unpredictable pockets. A salt lick here, a mineral spring there, the still warm blood of a freshly killed animal. That was the entire toolkit. Your body requires sodium to function, full stop. Not as a preference, but as a hard requirement. Your heart depends on it to fire correctly. Your neurons depend on it to send signals down their length. Without enough sodium, the fluid surrounding your cells starts to collapse. Blood pressure drops, muscles stop contracting the way they are supposed to. A human being can die from sodium deficiency within days. Your body has always understood this, which is why it built in an alarm. A craving sharp and specific enough that you would still feel it today if you went long enough without any salt at all. Early humans felt that alarm constantly, with no dependable way to answer it, which is exactly the question researchers have spent decades chasing. Not simply when humans began eating salt, but when they started deliberately going out to find it, the moment sodium stopped being something people stumbled across and became something people actively hunted. The first real clue does not come out of a laboratory. It comes from watching animals. Nearly every large plant-eating mammal on Earth actively seeks out sodium deposits. Elephants across parts of East Africa travel long distances toward mineral-rich caves, using their tusks to gouge salt-laced rock straight out of cave walls and eat it directly. Deer across North America lick roads salt off winter pavement the moment it appears. Gorillas in Central African forests eat sodium-rich aquatic plants and riverbank soil specifically to round out their mineral intake. None of this is accidental behavior. These animals are answering the exact same biological signal your own body sends you every time you reach for that shaker. Early humans were close, patient observers of exactly this kind of behavior. They followed herds. They tracked seasonal migration routes. And the places animals returned to again and again, the mineral springs, the salt licks, the sodium-heavy river clay, became the places humans returned to as well. For hundreds of thousands of years, that was essentially the entire strategy. Go where the animals go, eat what the animals eat, let the landscape reveal where the sodium is hiding. That strategy carried one brutal weakness. Salt sources are not distributed evenly across a landscape. They cluster tightly in certain geological regions and vanish almost entirely in others, and large stretches of East Africa, where a great deal of early human evolution unfolded, run genuinely low on accessible sodium. Researchers who study the link between mineral availability and early human diet have suggested that sodium scarcity likely functioned as a persistent, low-grade stressor for early hominins, not an outright crisis, but a constant background pressure, a body perpetually running slightly undersupplied, a craving that never fully resolved. That pressure appears to have shaped behavior in ways still visible in the anthropological record today. Research into cooperative breeding and resource sharing among early human populations has turned up something striking buried inside the childcare data. Rare, high-value resources, things like honey, animal fat, and mineral-rich foods, moved through a group far more freely than ordinary, easily replaced resources ever did. If one member of a foraging group located a salt deposit, it rarely stayed private information. It spread through the group because the group's overall survival depended on that sodium reaching everyone, not staying with whoever happened to find it first. That is how ancient salt sharing worked. Not through trade and not through ownership, but through the same cooperative instinct that let a comparatively slow, weak, clawless species outlast animals that were faster and stronger in almost every other respect. The raw research tells one version of this story. The lived, physical reality tells a much more vivid one. Picture a small band of early humans, perhaps 24 people, moving through what is now the Horn of Africa, roughly 100,000 years ago. They are tracking a dry riverbed northward because the rains failed that season and the herds they depend on have already moved. One woman, well into adulthood, has walked this exact route before. She leads the group toward a bend in the valley where she remembers the ground smelling different, where the soil dries into a faint white crust after the water recedes. She has seen that crust twice before in her lifetime, and she knows exactly what it means. The group stops. They scrape at the earth with flat stones and bare fingers, then eat the mineral-laced clay directly, their bodies drawing sodium out of the ground before they have any cleaner method of extracting it. The children eat it too. The taste is sharp and slightly bitter. Nothing close to the clean crystal salt sitting on your table right now, but the relief their bodies register is immediate and unmistakable, a signal firing somewhere below conscious thought, somewhere far older than language itself. They camp there for 2 nights before moving on, because the deposit is small and temporary, and the sodium it holds is already beginning to run thin. Find it. Use it. Move on. That was the rhythm of salt for the overwhelming majority of human history. Some of today's remaining hunter-gatherer populations still show exactly this pattern in action. Communities in East Africa who continue to live largely by hunting draw most of their sodium directly from meat and organ tissue rather than any separately harvested mineral. A hunter who brings down a large animal will often eat the liver almost immediately, still warm, because the sodium stored inside that organ does real, immediate physiological work. Anthropologists who have spent extended time living alongside these communities have documented diets naturally high in animal products during certain seasons, diets that keep sodium intake perfectly adequate without ever touching an external salt source. There is no shaker on the table. There does not need to be, because the food itself has not yet had its natural sodium stripped away by processing the way most modern food has. A closely related pattern shows up among hunter-gatherer groups studied extensively across the Kalahari Desert throughout the middle of the last century, whose natural, unprocessed diet delivered a daily sodium intake that lines up almost exactly with what modern cardiologists now consider the ideal target for a healthy human heart. Your ancestors were hitting that mark without trying, without measuring anything, simply because the food itself was already correctly balanced. Then agriculture arrived, and the entire arrangement broke. But before that particular collapse, something else happened first. Something that permanently rewired the human relationship with sodium and quietly set every subsequent salt road, salt war, and salt empire into motion. Humans learned how to manufacture it. Archaeological work at a site in northeastern Romania, called Lunca, pushed the known timeline of deliberate salt production back much further than most researchers expected. The site contains ceramic vessels, fire pits, and structural remains dating back roughly 8,000 years. and the overall layout matches what researchers describe as a genuine, purpose-built salt production facility, a place where people boiled natural brine from a mineral spring specifically to extract crystallized sodium. This was not incidental contact with a mineral deposit stumbled across once. This was an organized, repeated system. What stops most people cold about this discovery is who was running it. Lunka was not a civilization in any conventional sense. There was no nearby city, no writing system, no complex central government. The people operating that site were early Neolithic villagers who had only recently given up a fully nomadic lifestyle, and they were already running a salt production operation sophisticated enough to leave a clearly identifiable archaeological signature behind. The broken pottery alone tells much of the story. Researchers recovered hundreds of shattered ceramic fragments at the site, casualties of a process that involved holding heavy pots full of brine directly over intense heat for hours at a stretch. The thermal stress cracked the vessels constantly, and the people using the site simply kept making new ones. That pattern of continuous breakage suggests Lunka was not used occasionally. It was worked season after season, quite possibly across multiple generations. And the salt produced there did not stay local. Chemical analysis of artifacts recovered from sites well beyond Lunka showed sodium signatures consistent with that exact spring, meaning the salt was moving, carried, traded, and distributed across a stretch of territory too wide to be anything other than a deliberate distribution network. Salt functioned as a real commodity before bronze was ever discovered, and long before writing existed anywhere on Earth. Lunka was not an isolated case either. Evidence of deliberate salt extraction from a large salt lake in northern China dates to roughly the same period, where researchers have identified residue patterns and tool assemblages consistent with organized harvesting of naturally evaporated surface salt. On the opposite side of the planet, archaeological work along the Peruvian coast has documented salt production sites, where ancient communities built shallow, clay-lined basins specifically to concentrate and evaporate seawater, dating to a period only slightly later. 3 separate continents, 3 unconnected cultures, no shared contact whatsoever, all arriving at the same basic solution within roughly the same narrow window of time. When a specific behavior shows up independently across separate, unconnected populations at roughly the same moment, it is usually a sign that something in the surrounding environment had genuinely changed. And something had. Farming had just begun. Grain is what did it. Once humans settled down and started eating primarily wheat, barley, and rice as dietary staples, their sodium intake collapsed almost overnight in evolutionary terms. Domesticated grain carries next to no natural sodium. A diet built heavily around cereal crops is a diet that leaves the body chronically undersupplied with the one mineral the human nervous system cannot manufacture on its own. Skeletal analysis comparing pre-agricultural and post-agricultural populations across multiple regions has consistently shown early farmers were, on balance, less healthy than the hunter-gatherers who came before them, shorter in stature, more prone to dental disease, carrying bone markers consistent with broader nutritional deficiency. Sodium deficiency itself does not leave a single clean signature in bone the way some other deficiencies do, but the surrounding pattern lines up cleanly. Farming made people measurably worse off nutritionally, at least initially, even as it allowed populations to grow far larger than hunting and gathering ever could. Salt did not become precious because humans suddenly developed a taste for it. Salt became precious because farming turned deficiency into the new default setting, and once deficiency became the default, controlling salt meant controlling survival itself. Picture a single morning at that same Romanian site roughly 8,000 years ago. The air carries a slight chill. The spring nearby gives off a faintly mineral, faintly sulfurous smell. A small group hauls heavy ceramic pots down to the water's edge and fills them with brine. Fires get built and tended for hours on end. Pots crack under the heat. New ones get made to replace them without complaint, because this is simply the work. When the water finally evaporates away completely, a crust of white crystal is left behind, scraped out carefully by hand and wrapped in leaves or animal hide. Some of it stays with the group. Some of it travels elsewhere, carried out along paths that would eventually become the very first salt trade routes in recorded human history. Humans had traded the nutrient-dense organ meat of wild animals for fields of dependable grain, invented agriculture in the process, and accidentally manufactured a sodium crisis for themselves that would take thousands of years to fully solve. There is a lesser known, equally remarkable chapter to this story out of ancient China, where engineers in the Sichuan region eventually developed something close to industrial drilling technology purely in pursuit of underground brine. Using percussion drilling techniques built around bamboo cable and iron bits, workers bored wells reaching depths that would remain genuinely impressive by any era's standards, tapping into deep underground brine deposits the surface world had no other way to reach. That single innovation turned salt production from a matter of scraping surface crust into a full-scale engineering discipline, centuries before comparable drilling technology appeared anywhere else on the planet. Every Roman soldier received part of his pay specifically in salt, which is the actual origin of the word salary. Ancient Egyptian embalmers preserved the dead using natron, a naturally occurring sodium compound. Because sodium sat so close to the center of their understanding of preservation and purity, that they applied it directly to the bodies of the dead. Every salt caravan route that crossed the Sahara, linking sub-Saharan Africa to Mediterranean trade networks, was built on precisely the same underlying desperation. Your Neolithic ancestors felt the moment their newly planted grain gave them plenty of calories while quietly stripping away their sodium. At the height of trans-Saharan trade, massive slabs of rock salt cut from desert mines were hauled across enormous stretches of open desert to be exchanged. In some documented cases, weight for weight against gold. Salt and gold, balanced evenly on the same scale, because in a farming world, sitting far from the ocean and far from any mineral spring, salt could genuinely keep you alive, and gold, whatever else it was worth, could not. Entire empires rose partly to control access to it. Borders were drawn around it. Governments taxed it relentlessly. A notorious salt tax in 18th century France stood as one of the most despised instruments of royal authority, applied unevenly across regions and enforced with real brutality, feeding directly into the popular anger that eventually helped fuel revolution. A famous 1930 salt march across India was never actually about seasoning food. It was a protest about basic survival, about a colonial government taxing a substance that hundreds of millions of human bodies genuinely required in order to keep functioning. That is what salt has always really been, not a condiment. A controlled substance, one that governments understood long before modern nutritional science ever existed, was so fundamentally necessary that whoever controlled it effectively controlled everything built on top of it. And then something strange happened. Salt got cheap. Industrial evaporation, mechanized mining, global shipping networks. Within roughly a century and a half, salt went from a genuinely precious commodity to one of the least expensive substances on the planet. Today, a bag of table salt costs less than a cup of coffee, and it shows up in nearly every processed food you eat, added invisibly long before the package ever reaches your hands. The scarcity disappeared entirely. The craving did not go anywhere at all. Your nervous system, your kidneys, your entire cardiovascular system remain calibrated for a hunter-gatherer's sodium intake, somewhere around 700 milligrams a day, pulled from unprocessed natural food. The average adult in the United States today consumes something closer to 3,400 milligrams a day, nearly 5 times that ancestral baseline, almost entirely from food that arrives already salted before it ever touches your plate. And still, the craving refuses to switch off. Your brain never quite registers enough, because the system that evolved specifically to chase down a rare, vital mineral hidden across an unforgiving landscape was never designed for a world where sodium sits inside almost everything, invisible, pre-added, essentially inescapable. The actual physiological mechanism behind that craving runs through your kidneys as much as your brain. A hormonal pathway called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system constantly monitors blood sodium and blood pressure. And the moment sodium levels dip even slightly, it triggers the release of a hormone called aldosterone, which instructs your kidneys to hold on to every available trace of sodium instead of flushing it out through urine. That same pathway appears to drive at least part of the psychological pull towards salty food. An internal signal insisting that sodium is scarce and worth actively pursuing, running exactly as it always has, regardless of how much salt is actually sitting in the pantry. Research into sodium deficiency has additionally shown it activates the same reward circuitry in the brain associated with other genuinely addictive experiences, flooding a deep reward center with dopamine the moment sodium is finally consumed. The relief you feel from salty food is not some metaphor for satisfaction. It is directly neurochemical. Your brain is rewarding you for locating something it still believes to be rare, because nobody ever told that ancient circuitry that scarcity ended generations ago. You are running genuinely ancient software inside a completely modern environment. And the software is doing precisely what it was always built to do: chase sodium, register relief the instant you find it, and never fully shut the alarm off, because for 300,000 years, shutting that alarm off completely would have gotten you killed. There is also a broader, stranger phenomenon tucked inside this story that researchers refer to as geophagy, the deliberate eating of soil or clay, specifically for its mineral content. It shows up across an enormous range of human cultures and time periods, frequently among pregnant women whose bodies demand extra minerals, and among children in regions where dietary sodium and other trace minerals remain genuinely difficult to obtain. Far from being a strange aberration, geophagy appears to be a direct, living continuation of exactly the same clay-eating behavior described in that riverbed scene from 100,000 years ago, a practice old enough that it never fully disappeared, just faded into the background as cleaner sources of sodium became more widely available. The alarm built into your body is still running, and it was calibrated for a world that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. Sit with that for a moment. Somewhere in northeastern Romania, 8,000 years ago, a person crouched over a cracked clay pot and scraped white crystal free with bare fingernails, solving the exact same problem your own body is quietly trying to solve every single time you reach for that shaker. They simply had to work far harder to reach the same answer. The salt sitting on your table right now marks the finish line of a 300,000-year search. Your ancestors tasted it first in blood, in clay, in the mineral runoff of a hidden spring. They followed elephants across entire landscapes to find it. They boiled brine for hours inside pots they already knew were going to crack. They hauled it across deserts and paid for it in gold, ounce for ounce. They built empires to hold on to it, and revolutions to take it back. And now it sits there, close enough to touch without even looking, completely unremarkable. The craving never left. Only the search is finally over.